Episode 43.
Figuratively speaking, this is the culture that's happening even amongst Muslims, where people are, quote unquote, and I don't mean it literally, obviously, but they're creating their own sort of God in their head.
Welcome to the Muslim Life Hackers Podcast, the weekly podcast providing you with tips and tricks on how to hack your life and maximize its potential. And now for your hosts, Mifra Maroof and Maheen Malik.
As we sail across the sea of life, so much.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Maheen Malik here, and this is episode 43 of the Muslim Life Hackers podcast. In this episode, my co-host Mifra Maroof is going to be interviewing Zakiyyah on the topic of the authentic self. Zakiyyah is a writer from Washington, D.C., and is the author of the award-winning best-selling trilogy, If I Should Speak. Her books and literature have been used in schools and universities all around America and in other countries for multicultural and religious studies. She writes about the interfaith struggles of Muslims and Christians, and the intercultural, spiritual, and moral struggles of Muslims. Today, Mifra is going to be interviewing her on the topic of the authentic self, what it means to be authentic, how we can align with our true self, and who we are in relation to our creator. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Mifra to get right into the interview.
Assalamu alaikum, Muslim Life Hackers. Welcome to another episode of the Muslim Life Hackers podcast. In this podcast, we have here a special guest, Zakiyyah, joining us on the show today. Assalamu alaikum, Zakiyyah. How are you?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. I'm good. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, we're good. We're really excited to have you on the show today.
And thank you for having me.
So we wanted to know more about the topic about the authentic self. First of all, would you be able to explain to our audience what exactly does it mean by the authentic self?
Well, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. When I think of authentic self, I think of two possibilities. We're either talking about the authentic self of our fitra, meaning the perfect nature in which Allah created us, in which we are propelled or inclined towards a path of obedience to Him. Or we are talking about the authentic self of our qadr, meaning what will ultimately be the path that we take that will lead to our destiny in the hereafter. And the difference between these two is something that people really don't think about when they begin to talk about who they really are. And the difference is so significant in the sense that when we're talking about our fitra, there are many aspects of that, but the foundational aspect of that is that we are living a life that is reflective of what Allah would want from us in respect to the purpose of our creation. But when we talk about our authentic self in respect to our qadr, this is a matter of the unseen. We don't know where we're going to end up in the hereafter, but whatever steps that we take in this life will ultimately lead either to paradise or hellfire. So sometimes when people are talking about their authentic self, they're actually talking about the test that Allah puts inside of them or in their life that they are supposed to overcome. And so, for example, if you look at someone who perhaps wants to live a life of sin, and it feels so right to them, this is their qadr. This is the destination that Allah gave them on this earth, that they will have to decide, are they going to live according to the authentic self of their fitrah, or are they going to oppose that? And so that's what I think of when I think of the authentic self, is we have to differentiate between what Allah wants for us and the choices we make that ultimately decide our fate in the hereafter.
Okay, so pretty much by the authentic self, you actually separate into two, as in there's the fitra and there's also the qadr, which is like what ultimately happens. Yes,
because we have, and when we say authentic, because authentic is just an English word, it doesn't necessarily have a definite meaning per se, in our religion, except that it is the truth of who we are. And the truth of who we are can be good or bad if we look at qadr. Now, we don't know the unseen. So therefore, as the scholars sometimes say, whenever we see a possible evil outcome, we fight qadr with qadr.
Yeah.
We actually use the knowledge that we actually want to obey Allah and want to get to paradise to fight against the possibility that our fate could be something different. But you also have under the authentic self of the fitra, you also have two parts when I think of authentic self. You have two parts of the fitra. You have the fitra that we all share, which is basically the spiritual part. Yeah. And then you have the authentic self, which is very unique to each person, where it's, for example, my personality, the things I like, the things I dislike. And this has nothing whatsoever to do with, something good or bad. It's just how Allah created me. Maybe I'm more outspoken. Maybe you're quiet. Maybe the person who will be friends with you will have a certain personality. Maybe a woman's husband will be of a certain characteristic. These are things that are also that are in our nature that Allah put inside of us that represent our authentic self, and they don't have a quality of good or bad. They just are what Allah gave us. And that's under the fitra, though, because those are the things, those are the tools that Allah gave us to live in a life of obedience to Him.
Okay, so like under those two, under the fitra, particularly the one that you spoke about, which was like unique to each person, is it possible that a person can be living their life and not being in touch with who they are uniquely, like who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made them to be, and they're not kind of like living in line with that?
Absolutely, it's possible. In fact, it's probably more common than actually living in line with who you really are, because we come from many different backgrounds, different cultures, and no matter whether you come from a society in which the predominant population is Muslim, or you come from a society where you're surrounded by non-Muslims, you have a certain idea of how things should or shouldn't be with worldly matters, how a woman should or should not be a certain way, how a man should or should not be a certain way. And so we end up a lot of times looking around us and deciding based upon our culture, our family, our friends, our society, and saying, this is what I have to be. Either I need to be outspoken, and you will find that this is something very common in the West, that everyone needs to be able to get up and give a speech and be able to wow all the audiences. Or if you look at some of the predominantly Muslim countries, it's the opposite. A woman should be very quiet. She shouldn't speak up. She shouldn't be, both of these are not, both of these are extremes.
Yeah.
The truth is that some people have, male or female, quite frankly, have more of an inclination to be quiet, more reflective. Their personality is not outgoing. They may be introverted. And then you also have, on the other end, people who are their personality is more active, more extroverted. And the bottom line is that we are sometimes so out of touch with that because we've been taught that this is right or wrong, or this must be or must not be based upon our cultures.
It's amazing how our culture can have such a big influence on a person and the way they see themselves. And like say if a person wants to find out, okay, so they actually grew up in a particular place, like say it was the West, right? And then after that later they actually want to realign with who they really are. How can they go about with doing that?
I think that one of the things that has to happen is that the person first needs to look within themselves and be honest with themselves about who they really are. At this point in their life, I'm assuming that anyone who's gotten to this point realizes that there are some inconsistencies, there's something that's wrong. But the first thing, especially if we're talking obviously about Muslims, is that we need to make sure that we're not confusing or mixing this issue of who we really are in terms of our personalities with who we really are in terms of the things we want to do that may or may not be pleasing to Allah. And the problem with this topic is that so often they get very confused. And people begin to believe that, this is who I am, and this is what I must do. Like, for example, even if you take an example of a child inside of her, or a young woman or a young man who's about to go to college, and the parents have decided, okay, I want you to do this such and such career, and they don't want to do it. Maybe, let's say, for example, a woman, she loves sports, but she doesn't want to be a teacher, a doctor, or engineer. And she's saying to her parents, this is who I am. I love to run. I love to jump. Why should I have to confine myself to a certain career? I think that in this case, the girl is confusing her authentic self with a career. And these are they don't necessarily have to oppose each other. You could be a teacher and you can still do sports when you go home. You could be, you could be a doctor and you can on the weekend play tennis, And what we have to realize is that sometimes, and I think this is a spinoff for, a lot of the influences that we get from different societies that tell us, be who you are, follow your heart. But we forget that every single circumstance that we're in is not one about being who you are in the sense of doing what you want. I mean, for example, we clean up our house not because we woke up and said, wow, my authentic self is cleaning houses.
Yeah.
You clean up your house because it needs to be done and it's dirty. And similarly, sometimes in certain situations, a career choice is not really about, and I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but in certain situations, and you have to know based upon istikhara, dua, reflecting on your situation, sometimes a career choice is really just about finding a field that you can go into, that you have some abilities in, that can help you support your family if you ever need it to work. It's not about necessarily doing, the thing that you always wanted to do. Now, ideally, that's great. If you can find a career that meets everything you love, that you can make money from it at the same time, that's wonderful. But I think this is important to differentiate when we're talking about a person making a decision that can cause huge problems in their families and also a problem in their future when it's not necessary because it's not mutually exclusive. You don't have to give up sports because you become a doctor. You don't have to give up sports because you become a teacher.
Yeah.
So these are things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about it. But going back to the question, how you do that is self-reflection, asking advice, and making dua. That's why we have istikhara. When we ask Allah for, about how we should go about certain things, because although when we're talking about authentic self, it sounds so clear, like, what's the definition? What should we do? But remember, as we're a part of this world, everything starts to get muddled. Like, for example, you find that in the West, a very popular discussion that's going on and that has found its way into Muslim countries and societies and communities, unfortunately, is this concept of homosexuality. Like, a person could be gay and lesbian. That's who they authentically are. And I know that might sound like an extreme example, but this is obviously not the authentic self of the fitra who Allah wanted us to be. So when we're talking about this, we have to be careful and to realize that is really, an issue of morality, of right and wrong. And this might be someone's qadr. Someone might have a test that is very, very severe in which they are given this trial that they don't know where it came from. But we cannot go into this idea that, let's find out who I really am, and then I go and follow a path that is in direct opposition to what Allah would want for us if we want our destination to be paradise.
Yeah. So if a person wants to differentiate between what's their what their nafs, their desires is telling them, and what they should do, then it really comes back to knowledge of the religion and praying istikhara.
Well, I would say even before we get into knowledge, the authentic self deals with the heart. Yeah. Because knowledge is not helpful to a heart that is not inclined to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first thing that we need to ask for is a purification of the heart. And a constantly, and this is why we make so much dua, this is why we recite Quran. This is a purification. Our life is a constant tazkiyah, it's constant purification. It's like taking a bath. So much emphasis sometimes is put on knowledge and acquiring information, and this is absolutely necessary. But if I don't have the heart, and that heart can only come from Allah purifying that for me. So the first thing I need to do is constantly make a commitment each and every day to constantly do things that will purify my heart so that my heart loves what Allah loves and dislikes what He dislikes. And this is not an easy exercise because you can have it for one moment and the next moment you do something and it turns. So the heart is always changing. So more important than the knowledge is actually a pure heart and a sincere heart. So that when the knowledge comes to you, you're able to receive it and recognize it as truth.
Yeah, so pretty much putting more priority on purifying one's heart, because that's how they're going to see through it and make their decisions.
Absolutely. And of course, coupled with the knowledge, we don't separate the two, because, I mean, Shaitan has a lot of knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah. So you absolutely must have that heart, and it's not something that you can look inside yourself and say, yes, I have a pure heart. You're constantly praying and hoping, praying and hoping and striving, praying, hoping and striving consistently until death, inshallah. And that's how you get back in touch with that authentic self. And again, we should not confuse having even if, for example, if I have a heart that's constantly being purified, that doesn't mean I'm not going to have desires or tests that pull me away from that. And that doesn't mean that they won't continuously happen until I die. This is a part of being on this earth. I mean, because if we were all in touch with our authentic self in a perfect way with no test, then that will be called Jannah, So,
yeah, that's so true. Like we won't be actually called dunya anymore, it will be Jannah. So going back to what you said about, like, for a person to help find themselves, like one of the things is like self-reflection. Would you say that today there's actually a lack of that happening?
I don't know that it's a lack of self-reflection, to be honest. I think that it's much more complicated than that. I think we live in a society, well, I'll put it like this. I live in the United States of America, and I find that at least the people that I'm in contact with, who generally tend to be very fluent in English and, have studied in the West and so on and so forth, we have a culture of self-help books, find yourself. So there's a lot of reflection and discussion going on, but it's not so much that the reflection is not happening. It's being done in a very selfish way that is distant from spirituality. And
that's interesting.
So it's when I'm talking to people, for example, when I'm doing dawah, when I'm talking to non-Muslims, when I'm talking to Muslims, I talk to people with many different walks of life. And what I find about people who are indulging in sin and who believe this to be the right path, because we live in a time, unfortunately, where Muslims, people who profess to be Muslims, are changing the religion to say, oh, we don't have to do this, this is outdated. And these people, from my experience when I'm talking to them, they spend a lot of time in reflection. But it's not necessarily connected to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would want them to be doing. It's connected to a lot of nafsi issues. I want this. I am this. Why would I have this if I'm not supposed to do it? Why would I? And so it's not so much that the self-reflection is not there. It's that this self-reflection is being kind of done in an independent way where I'm number one. And after I finish, I put God's name on it at the end. I put Allah's name after it's over, after I'm done. Once I realize that, it makes sense that I don't have to wear hijab. It makes sense that I don't have to follow the rules of marriage and intimacy. And it makes sense that I don't have to agree with these quote-unquote orientations. It makes sense that, I don't have to pray every day because, I'm really busy. And then they say, and that's how Allah would want it, because otherwise, why would he make me this way?
Yeah, that's true. So it's not that there isn't self-reflection happening. It's more that, like, the way it's happening, it's not the right one.
Well, I don't even want to say it's not the right one. I would just say it's being done in an inverse order.
So what would be the right order then?
The first thing is that we have to realize that we have a creator. We didn't create ourselves. So the first self-reflection needs we need to ask, what does my creator want from me? Who did he intend for me to be on this earth? And then after we figure that out, then we can get into our personal likes and dislikes and choices, but there's a lot of reflection, but it's basically not necessarily in tune with Allah. It's almost like, for example, it's this concept, although this is not an Islamic concept, but it is a concept that's happening in the West, is that they make this claim that you people who believe in God, you created God. And obviously this is not true, but figuratively speaking, this is the culture that's happening even amongst Muslims, where people are, quote unquote, and I don't mean it literally, obviously, but they're creating their own sort of God in their head. Like, Allah is not separate, who he taught us who he is. We decide who he is, and we bring him into our life in the way that we want to. And so you will find that amongst people who believe in God, you'll find many different teachings going on, but they're all using God's name. And so they're creating their own concept of who they want God to be in their life. And then they move forward based on that.
So like pretty much instead of like having the first question to be, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want me to do? It's like it's actually being turned to like, what should I do? And then after that, like the second.
Yes, exactly. Basically, and it's not something that's done on a conscious level, by the way. This is not something that people are sitting down and deciding, what, I'm going to put myself first and then I'm going to put Allah next. No, it's actually, it's so muddled and confused inside of people's head. It feels natural. It feels normal. And that's actually how people come to conclusions about things. Like when you talk to people, they seem so quote unquote sincere about it. Like you thought about it, and God would not want us to be put into this great difficulty of covering our hair. These are the kinds of conversations people have. God would not want us to be put into this great difficulty of not acting on our sexual desires if we want to. And it's very strange because it's as if they're rewriting the religion, for themselves, and then they're going to share it with other people as if they have received some sort of wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to now guide the rest of the world to their misguidance. So it's very, very complicated.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting observation that's like really subtle, and like a person won't really know that they're doing that unless like they really like step back and think about it. Where is their thinking process going? Is it starting off with, what do I want to do? Or is it like, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want me to do?
Exactly. And it's very, and it's not for issues that are not mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah, because there are sometimes situations that we face and it's not an inherently religious issue. It's not always going to be obvious, but it's very helpful when we are dealing with something which is obvious, whether or not we should cover, or whether and how we should live our life morally with regards to the opposite sex. And nowadays it's actually become the same sex, so these sorts of things are covered in the Quran and Sunnah. So this doesn't take a lot of stepping back. It really takes a lot of just consciously engaging with the Quran and Sunnah in a sincere way, ignoring all the little voices and the things that you want to believe, and just actually asking yourself truly from the bottom of your heart, when it's just you and Allah, what is it that Allah would have me believe?
So having that sincerity.
Yeah, absolutely. Having this sincerity, because it's almost impossible when it comes to clear issues to get misguided in that way unless you make a conscious decision to distance yourself from the Quran and to distance yourself from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and make your primary feeding of the soul something else, and which is what people do. They're feeding their souls with other material other than the Quran. And I was just in a conversation with someone the other day who was falling into that, may Allah guide her back. And she was basically coming up kind of with her own little new religion with all kinds of new rules, where even the concept of marriage was no longer, she was saying nikah has outdated, and as I listened, as I was reading her words, I realized that all of the material that she was telling me to read to better understand where she was coming from, all of it was coming from sources that were not from the Quran and the Sunnah. And so for someone to get to that point, you have to feed your soul consciously and purposefully. You have to feed your soul with something that is outside of Allah's revelations, to the point where this person was now speaking of humans' books as being more authentic than Allah's. And it's very scary to see that kind of process unfolding before your eyes. So these people are feeding their souls with information that comes from a human being, and they're treating it as if it's revelation from Allah.
Yeah, that's true. we're just actually nearing the ending of our interview. Like before we end off, I just want to ask you a final question. So if a person wants to get back into like the right frame of thinking in order to find the authentic self, then if you were to summarize it in a few action points, what would they do? Because I know that you actually touched upon the one about being conscious of what you're feeding your soul. So just some action points a person can take going forward.
I would say the number one is dua, is supplication and prayer. That is the first thing, alone and consistently by yourself. And I would say number two is constantly reading the Quran. And then, and number three is just actually once you add your, and by the way, number one and number two are constant. This is something you have to do every single day. And number three, find out the practical ways, because everyone's story is different. What are the practical ways that you can act upon that in a way that does not go outside of Allah's laws?
So pretty much the first one being making sure that we engage in dua and like supplication and make sure we're reading the Quran as well. And the third one, like that's where the whole like finding out the practical way, and that depends person to person.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Find out the practical way. I mean, if they're like, for example, if I love sports, I'm going to go and research how I can do that, while I'm still covered or in a way that's not compromising my modesty. Because you absolutely, as a woman, can be involved in sports and different things like that. If I wanted to follow a certain career, I'll go and research what are the options for this career path. And that will be different for each and every person. But what's not different is to constantly make dua and to constantly engage yourself with the Quran, just you and Allah, no one else, without trying to rationalize anything, and just constantly asking Allah to guide you on the right path and purify your heart.
Oh, perfect. That really puts things into perspective and really puts our, with that focus, it really puts our hearts in the right place, so that after that, if we're seeing it, we're our priorities are right.
Absolutely.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining us for today's interview. We're just end of our time for the interview. So for our listeners who don't know about you, would you be able to tell them where can they find you online?
They can just go to my website at uzauthor.com. That's my initials, Zakiyyah, author, uzauthor.com.
Okay, so uzauthor.com. Perfect. Okay, so thank you so much once again, Umm Zakiyyah, for joining us on today's interview. We hope to speak to you again soon then.
So that concludes the episode on the topic of the authentic self. As usual, you can find all the links and resources mentioned in this episode, and also the links to Zakiyyah's sites in our show notes at muslimlifehackers.com/43. And to find out more about Muslim Life Hackers and to check out our other episodes and interviews like this one, you can go to our website at muslimlifehackers.com or hook into one of our apps on Apple, Android and Windows devices. That's all for today. Until next time, Muslim Life Hackers, aim high, take action and be awesome.
But first we